Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm so excited to welcome animator, writer, and director Jay Lender to the podcast. Welcome, Jay.
Hey there.
Very happy to have you. I love starting by asking about creative influences. So, for you, what were some of your favorite shows and movies growing up that helped frame your comedic style?
I guess certainly for animation, it all begins with Bugs Bunny.
Hmm.
When I was a little kid, a lot of the old Warner Brothers catalog was in syndication and would just air after school every day around 3 o'clock. We'd have an hour or sometimes even 2 hours of Warner Brothers cartoons, and I would see all of this, the golden age stuff that was done from even from the late 30s and mid 30s clear up to the certainly 47, which was where I think the old MGM slash Warner Brothers package ended. So anything that went up to that period, I would see. And we saw them over and over and over again. So we knew every line of them. And then on Saturday mornings, they would run the post 1947 stuff that went up to around 1967 that Warner Brothers kept in their catalog, and that would have been running on ABC and in the mornings on Saturday, the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner hour. So we got to see the whole sweep of this kind of wise guy golden age animation, and I absolutely loved it. I drew Bugs Bunny all day long. You worked on the voices. The Disney stuff was out there, but a little bit harder to get a hold of. They would show some of that on Sundays on The Wonderful World of Disney. And then as videotapes came in, it was possible to get more, and there were occasional re releases in the theaters. But it wasn't really until I got into college, I think, that the Disney stuff I was really able to study and watch, all the old shorts. But certainly Warner Brothers cartoons, a little bit of Disney, Marx Brothers, The Twilight Zone, original series Star Trek, because in my formative years there was no other Star Trek. I loved all of that stuff. The golden age of television, golden age of movies. I don't know how you can watch that stuff and not be influenced. They really understood because they were inventing the ways to tell a story in film medium. And I still watch nothing but that's well, I nothing but is strong. I watch a lot of that stuff now. I mean, nobody was better. I talk about old music and old film all the time, and occasionally this idea comes up about Frank Sinatra. So you have Frank Sinatra's version of Fly Me to the Moon. And once that comes out, forevermore, and this is true of almost anything that Sinatra sang, forevermore, you're either doing Sinatra's version of that song or you're running away from Sinatra's version of that song. And in terms of film technique and storytelling on film, the stuff that was done in the golden age when they really figured all of that stuff out, you are either using those techniques or you're somehow avoiding those techniques. And there's value in that in certain circumstances. But, the classics are the classics.
Absolutely. And all that stuff that you mentioned, like a lot of those, like none of them have gone away. That's the thing. And there's been so many, obviously, revivals and reboots of all these things and different versions, like Star Trek, like you said. Like, so it's interesting how what makes things a classic and then just really it sticks and then it can span generations.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's also a huge difference in the kind of landscape that those classics came into. And I talk about this occasionally because, I was lucky enough to be involved with SpongeBob early on, and that is a classic. And I recognize that, and I feel comfortable saying it 20 plus years down the road. But I also know that the kind of impact that SpongeBob had on launch and how it instantly became water cooler talk and whatever the equivalent to water cooler talk is for children on a global scale, that can't really be achieved now. And, part of the reason is back then we had just a few channels, even just a few cable channels. There was no streaming. There were no video games sucking up the kind of time now that, a AAA video game sucks up in your life. Like when you play Red Dead Redemption now, you're in for months. And that kind of experience didn't exist back then. We didn't have social media. So a new show, a new idea comes into an extremely fragmented landscape. And it's impossible to capture a global audience that is that broad and that huge. So I don't know that we'll ever see new classics that can be as culturally influential as the ones that came 20 years ago and before.
That is what's so interesting. And obviously with streaming, that there's no appointment viewing anymore where everyone would sit down and watch the same thing like with the same few networks back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it is much different how we consume media. Nowadays it's kids watching things on YouTube, and we all, generally speaking, have much shorter attention spans even. It is interesting how our viewing habits have changed. Despite all of that, is that we're drawn to good characters, good storytelling, humor, all that same stuff though. So that's
Right.
yeah.
None of that changes, but I think that the people who have enough money to actually launch these programs, the producers, the big
Yeah.
studios, because the audience is so fragmented, because it's so difficult to launch a new concept, they've become much more conservative about what they want to put out there. So even though the formula, if I can say formula for creating engaging content hasn't necessarily changed, their willingness to take the little risks to tell stories about a sponge who lives under the water with his starfish friend, etc. I don't know that anyone has the nerve to do that. What is interesting about this particular moment, as we're sort of in second wave streaming, where the companies that own these streamers are starting to realize, okay, we've built up a lot of content, we've got it now. We need to find a version of this viewing experience that can actually sustain an audience. So appointment viewing is probably making a comeback. Maybe not, it'll never be what it was because there will still be on demand is a valuable feature and people like it. But the time when they release something, they're thinking twice about it now. I mean, Netflix burned themselves by dumping entire series at a drop, and they lost the opportunity to build an audience and allow water cooler talk to happen and word of mouth to spread. I don't know that they've learned their lesson. They've got some pride tied up in doing things the way they do, but Disney and all of these other people who have these kinds of streaming services have learned it. And they've also learned that not everyone wants a huge epic novel for television, that sometimes people turn on the television because they want to have a particular itch scratched. And suddenly you've got a show like Poker Face, which is, essentially modern Columbo, and they don't feel the need to drop $10 billion creating, a world for her in the volume like The Mandalorian. And there can be a little bit of continuity, but we can also just tell a story that involves characters we love and people we love in a situation that we know the structure of, but maybe not the details of. There's value in all of this stuff. And I think, now that the initial building phase for the streamers is gone, we may see a return to some values. Values is a dumb word. A return to formats and structures and consumption experiences that feel more like what I grew up with.
It is interesting how things just come back in general. I don't know, like trends that were from decades ago then come back, or whether that's with TV, whether that's just with anything in general. I do find that fascinating because, like what you mentioned with kind of water cooler talk and the equivalent of that with kids, because I do remember like in elementary school, when I say my entire class, we'd all be like excited talking about the latest episode of SpongeBob. I do remember that. I mean, like, oh, this was so like this, all of us like breaking it down as little kids. That's so funny. And it is interesting to think because I know that SpongeBob almost wasn't picked up by Nickelodeon. Like they had I guess, doubts about it. I know like a big thing was that they weren't sure about SpongeBob, the character, being an adult, and that's why they wanted him to go to school. Like I find that fascinating, the fact that it almost like they almost passed on it. This what turned out to be this global sensation. Of course, no one can predict like what's going to be a hit. That's what's fascinating too, that every hit is a fluke, as they say, you know, because you never know what's going to resonate.
Yeah, we knew that it was good when we were working on it, but there was no way anyone could have predicted this. And as far as, SpongeBob nearly not being picked up, everything is nearly not picked up. I mean,
Very
I
true,
I
true.
think in the end, the only reason anything gets picked up is we're at the end of the quarter, and if you don't use your funds, we're going to take them away from you. We need something to go out, so whatever is closest to go goes. And I mean, I've been out there in the business dealing with executives long enough, and there's endless Hollywood wisdom about how that stuff works. William Goldman will tell you nobody knows anything or nobody knows nothing, how depending on who you're talking to. And it's true. They don't know. And you may pitch something to someone and they'll tell you why they don't like it and how it doesn't fit in with what we want our offerings to be, but they don't really know why they're saying no.
Mhm.
And even if they even if they're right that it doesn't fit in with our mission statement or whatever, the mission statement is a convenience you have when you don't have a show yet. When you have a show, you back your show and it works or it doesn't work. And they may say no to you because they don't like the color shirt you're wearing. And they may not know that's why they're saying no. You just gave them the wrong feeling that day. Nobody ever understands how any of these things happen, but occasionally all the gears line up and you get something great. And I think that's going to have a lot to do with who the executives are, what they let go by, what they're going to get involved with, who's on the crew, the timing. It could be the thing you follow when your show premieres. I mean, there's there's so many elements that are involved in the success, and only some of it happens when you're making the product. The rest of it is going to happen later. Like, a good example, Stephen Sondheim, whom I love, his musical Assassins premiered like right after the Gulf War started. And you don't want to be launching a new musical that's kind of weirdly critical of American culture right as we're going through this sort of rah rah up with America moment. So it flopped, and people recognized that it's great. They love it now. But at the time when it was new and could have gone out and made a lot of money and maybe played for 2, 3 years or whatever, it was dead on arrival. And, it's not because he didn't make the right musical. It's great. It's because, something weird happened that nobody could predict. And I'm sure there are a lot of weird things that happened when SpongeBob premiered or when Hey Arnold premiered that nobody could have predicted. I don't spend a lot of time analyzing it. I'm just glad it worked out okay.
Absolutely. That's true, because sometimes it is, I don't know, like all just basically all these things that line up perfectly, because Ted Lasso obviously is such a beloved show, and that came right at the right time, like in late 2020 when people were in desperate need of optimism and everything,
Yeah.
So like that's just an example, but yeah, I do find that interesting.
And someone on Ted Lasso may say, "Oh, well, we saw the vibe and we knew we needed to make a show that was like this." But I guarantee there are 15 other guys who also thought they saw the vibe and their show didn't work. It's you can't possibly get into all the details of all of it. You need, Harry Seldon, you need psychohistory. You need gigantic millions and trillions of people to understand the mechanisms behind why something succeeds and fails. All you can do is make the best show. God, what a weird path to take. Why would I talk about foundation? All you can do is make the show that you like,
Yeah.
because I can never know whether an audience will like it. I can't make shows for kids. All I can do is make shows for me that aren't hostile to kids. And then a kid can watch the show. So, I don't have sex and miserable things that we don't want kids to watch, and violence and blood, unless I want to make that show. That's not for kids. But it's I go back to Chuck Jones. People would ask him because when Chuck Jones became a minor celebrity in the 70s, let's say, when the boomers were finally old enough to start guiding culture, and they would interview him like, we love your stuff. And guess what? We still love it, even though we're adults. This is how you end up with Roger Rabbit and that kind of thing, because the boomers, finally in control, could say, well, we want to make cartoons like they used to make back then, the stuff that we loved. But they would ask him, how did you ever make these kiddie cartoons that adults could watch and like? Like serious critics would ask this. And he would say, well, we didn't make them for kids and we didn't make them for adults. We made them for ourselves. And that's really the answer. You're the only judge that you can trust. So you make something you love, and then hopefully it finds an audience. Hopefully there is an audience. Hopefully you have marketers who understand how to reach those people and don't try to shoehorn you into a place where you don't belong.
Definitely. I know Roger Rabbit obviously was like a turning point in animation, but like the animation live action hybrid, obviously. And then obviously Little Mermaid, which now, of course, there's the remake, but with all those Disney classics. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But so of course, so I know you got your start working on one of my all-time favorite shows that to this day resonates with me as an adult, Hey Arnold. I'd love to hear how you got, like, what was it like working on that show and how you got that job in the first place?
I got that job. This was after I had been at CalArts, and I started out at Rhode Island School of Design. I did 2 years there. First year is sort of foundation art stuff, very general survey, 2D figure drawing, 3D color, very broad art training. And then second year was when I was going to specialize in animation, and I discovered right away it was not the right school for me because they were pushing toward a sort of Film Board of Canada festival animation art film lifestyle, and that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to do Bugs Bunny. So they mentioned CalArts to me as sort of like a threat. If you really want to do that, go to this school and they'll make you do exercises and you have to turn heads around and like go see how you like that. And I was like, sign me up. So I came out to California. I started over again as a freshman. I did my 4 years. And along the way, I was watching people from my class plucked off the vine and given jobs at Disney, working on, this new movie that they were going to make, The Little Mermaid or whatever it was. A couple of people headed off to Pixar. I think Pete Docter finished CalArts, but just immediately Pete Docter, Jill Colton, legends went out. And I could not compete. I was not that person. I was not a brilliant animator. I didn't really understand storyboard. I sort of had a little bit of training in animation in betweening, which was, sort of entry level position. That's what they were training us for. We were a feeder school for Disney. But I didn't actually get that job, and I couldn't get a job on The Simpsons. So I lurked around for a year and a half almost, unable to find work. And I tried everywhere. I was lugging my portfolio all around town, couldn't make it happen. Finally, one of my teachers, Ken Bruce, who was my mentor, was working on Ren and Stimpy, and Nickelodeon at the time was not an actual studio. They had a couple of rented offices in different parts of town. But through the grapevine, he had heard that they were about to start hiring for this new show, Hey Arnold. So I jumped in my car. I was still living in Valencia, where CalArts was. No reason to move because I didn't have a job. And I drove 90 miles an hour down to Burbank, and I was the first person through the door. And I tell this story all the time, and it's true. When a new show starts, and this is true of animation, it's true of anything, probably true even outside of Hollywood, you hire your friends first, then you hire friends of friends, and then you hire whoever's sitting in the lobby. Because if you don't know whether they're good and no one's willing to vouch for them, you just need to get an ass in the seat as soon as possible so you can find out if they can do the job. And I was that guy. So they had me do a storyboard test, which I would not do now. Tests are ethically wrong. If they want to pay me to do a storyboard test, sure, that's paid work. I'll do that. But my feeling is that if you want to make a show, one of your costs of doing business is you take the risk on a new employee. So anyway, they had me do a storyboard test, and I was too green to say no. I did it, and they said, great, we're going to give you a storyboard job. You'll start on the fourth rotation. So we have other teams coming in. In the meantime, do you want something to do? And I was like, yeah, great. So they had me do background design. I was, working on designs for the interior of Arnold's house, things that hadn't been seen in the pilot. And I designed the aquarium and a million street scenes and stuff like that. And I sort of made the mistake of being good at it. So when my storyboard rotation came up, they said, why don't you stay here in background design? We're going to give your storyboard job to someone new. So I missed my opportunity and ended up marooned in the lower paying job, which was not what I expected. And it was fine. I mean, I loved doing the work. I learned a lot. Every once in a while, I would kick and scream, and they would throw me a little bit of storyboard work so that I could, get back to doing backgrounds. And I let that go on for about a year and a half. And I loved Hey Arnold, and I continue to love Hey Arnold. It was not just a great show, but a perfect first show because we had a mission. And you have to understand, growing up when I did in the 70s and 80s, certainly in the 70s, animation was a wasteland. We had, Filmation cartoons, which were not even shovelware. They barely moved. The scripts were, cookie cutter nonsense. There was no passion there. And I don't say this as a knock on them. The money wasn't there to do it. And these were all, a lot of old guys coming out of Disney who, were spoiled as they should have been in the golden age, doing amazing stuff. And now they were just being asked to push their pencils across paper. They made a lot of bad stuff. It was unfortunate, but that's what I grew up with. And when Roger Rabbit hit, and suddenly the money is showing up to make good shows, and good shows like cool, exciting, challenging shows like Hey Arnold are the goal. Like, we want to push buttons here. We want to try to make something amazing. And that's not always the case in Hollywood because it's a business. So it was a really unusual moment. And we were making this cool show, like, an episode like Pigeon Man that has a down ending. It's devastating. It's amazing. The Christmas episode, with Mr. Wynn, and we're talking, pretty much directly about the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon. That's insane. That's absolutely nuts. So I was thrilled to be there doing background or writing or whatever it was. But about a year and a half after that, I said, it's time to put up or shut up. Give me the storyboard job or I'm going to quit. And they didn't give it to me. So I quit. And I ended up working at Film Roman on a show called Sea Bear and Jamal, which was a fun Saturday morning cartoon. And I got the storyboard job there. So you have to move laterally to move vertically, because you'll always, every day I stayed at Nickelodeon working in backgrounds, I became more valuable in backgrounds. They're never going to want to move me over into this other job where maybe I'm not that good. They don't know yet. So you move to another studio, they don't care who you are. You're the ass they're going to put in the seat because they ran out of friends, and they ran out of friends of friends. So I did that for a couple of months, 2 or 3 shows there. And then Nickelodeon needed a storyboarder again. And now the math has changed. Do we want someone who knows the show or someone who doesn't know the show? So they were willing to bring me back and give me a storyboard job. And that's how I ended up in the room with Tuck Tucker and then Dan Povenmire and on and on.
Amazing. I know all these greats that went on, because I know Dan Poppmeyer with Phineas and Ferb, and then obviously Stephen Hillenburg with, well, he didn't work on, did he work on Hey Arnold? No,
He
it's
did not work on Hey Arnold.
Rocco, right?
He was on Rocco before
Right.
Hey Arnold, and then while I was on Hey Arnold, he may have been out of the studio for a while, or just
Mm.
wrapping up Rocco. He was doing the pilot for SpongeBoy upstairs with Derek Dryman while I was working on I'm sorry, on Hey Arnold.
Oh,
So
nice.
we knew he was doing something, but we didn't really know what it was.
Oh, see, and then look what it became. But so with Hey Arnold, though, do you personally have like a favorite contribution to the show? I mean, I could talk about Hey Arnold forever, and SpongeBob too. We'll get into, but I just adore Hey Arnold.
Hey Arnold, yeah, I mean, I obviously, and I guess maybe it's not obvious. It should be obvious. Pigeon
Mm.
Man is the
Yeah.
greatest thing ever. I love it. I was marginally, very marginally involved in some story meetings on that, probably just, shaking my head, yes, 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 yes. And then it was one of my first big storyboard assignments when I was agitating to get that kind of work. Jamie Mitchell, who was our supervising director, gave me the end of the show. So from the moment from Arnold walking out of the roof,
Mhm.
that little stairwell on the roof, to the end of the show was me storyboarding. And I barely understood storyboard. I certainly was not much of an artist at the time, but I think that probably, at least not understanding storyboard, probably helped me because I didn't realize how weird it was to do something Jamie called at the time analysis of action, for instance, where Pigeon Man um, throws his arms up and all of the birds fly away holding on to the rings. And we show it from three different angles, moving backward in time each time. That is not a normal thing to do in anything, let alone a kid's cartoon. But it didn't strike me as weird. I just did it. And I don't know if I would have done it if I had been an experienced storyboarder. And I think it's really cool now when I watch that episode. I love how that moment builds. But it was super fun to work on this show that I loved and then get this episode that spoke to me in a bunch of different ways. I mean, it spoke to me certainly as an outcast, a bit of a pigeon man on my own, because I think all of us in the arts are. And I certainly understood where he was coming from, where, you just recognize you're never going to fit in, and that's okay. Like
Mhm.
Arnold needs to have it explained to him that it's okay. This isn't a problem that needs to be solved. The problem that needs to be solved is everyone trying to come in and solve my problem. Let
True.
me be who I am. So that spoke to me. And the idea of having a down ending, of pushing this cartoon into uncomfortable places for kids and telling them it's okay to be uncomfortable, spoke to me creatively, or as a young creative professional, because those are the kinds of things that I wanted. That's what moved me when I was a kid. I mentioned Twilight Zone earlier on. You have to work hard to find a comfortable ending for an episode of the Twilight Zone. And I did not find that off-putting as a kid. I found it reassuring because I'm watching shows and seeing, oh, thank God, things don't always work out well. That explains how I feel about so many things in my life. And it's okay to feel that way. And, I feel like cartoons and shows for kids, a lot of the time, the executives are terrified to allow them to deal with those kinds of feelings because we don't want the kids to feel bad. But who are you kidding? Kids feel bad. They know their lives are real. Real stuff happens to them all day long. And we need to give them the tools to deal with it. And I felt like Hey Arnold was a show that was all about that, you know, acknowledging that life is complicated and hard and messy and ugly and sometimes unsatisfying, but be prepared for that. And here's what you can do to live with that when that's happening. I just thought it was great. And I would love to see more stuff like that. And I know every network is now thinking, especially Nickelodeon, what's our next SpongeBob? And SpongeBob has a place because kids also need mindless entertainment. But I I would love for them instead to be saying, where's our next Hey Arnold? And understanding that that means more than just kids in school.
Yeah.
I think that that level of risk taking is very hard to find. And one of the reasons it was possible to find it back at Nickelodeon is that they were the upstart channel that had no hope competing against Disney in feel good, bland kid entertainment. That how are they ever going to beat them at that game? That's their territory. So they were the network that thumbed their nose at parents and did things that they knew were risky. Hey Arnold was risky in a lot of ways. And now, once SpongeBob became a hit and Nickelodeon got a taste of that kind of money, now they're conservative like everybody else. And eventually that will dry up and they'll be like, well, we might as well take a risk, and they'll have a huge hit. And then they'll be saying, like SpongeBob was risky in its way, they'll have a huge hit, and then they'll be like, we need more stuff exactly like this. And around we go.
Absolutely. Oh gosh. I do of course want to get into SpongeBob. So I know, so you worked like with like the golden era of SpongeBob, those first 3 seasons. And obviously
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong, but those seasons in particular, they were storyboard driven, right? So that means
Correct.
yeah, okay. So
Correct.
yeah, so that means it's set. So I would love to hear a little bit about the creative process with that. Like what did you as a storyboard artists, did you just go off of an outline and then obviously coming up with a dialogue? How'd that all work?
Well, I mean, it was very flexible. We were making up a lot of it as we went along because it was a new show. I mean, we were certainly not the first storyboard driven show, not even at Nickelodeon. Rocco had done that. And I think, Steve coming out of Rocco knew that that was the way to go with this show. And with a lot of shows, maybe even most shows. But we had a writing staff that would develop the premises, and I had no real window onto that world. I never went to those meetings. Like I went to story meetings on Hey Arnold. There was something about Hey Arnold. Most of it took place in the rented space. It was like guerrilla cartoon making. We really felt like we were outsiders. A couple of years younger on average, maybe. And, they were not really interested early on on Arnold in that kind of regimentation and formalism with regard to how we make the show. There was no one at Nickelodeon who was going to tell them how to do it because they didn't have an animation studio. They didn't know what was going on. They were just like, we need to make cartoons. Do you know how to make a cartoon? Come make one for us. So that's the way it was. And because of that, I was able to float into writers' meetings. Not that I was writing, not that I was incredibly helpful, but I was able to be there. So I saw a lot of that stuff on Hey Arnold, not so on SpongeBob. They had their writers' room, and a couple of people, Paul Tibbett in particular, was able to work in that room and then also work as a storyboarder. Um, I was not one of those guys. So I would get a premise. It was 2 or 3 pages and had all of the major story beats. And we'd read it, and it would be like, okay, SpongeBob promises Patrick he's going to give him a big Valentine's Day present. They go to the fair, and the present never arrives, and Patrick gets mad. Okay, and then I would crunch up that thing with my writing partner, and we would kind of throw it away. Not that there was something wrong, but the more you get into a text description of this kind of show, the less freedom you have. And the freedom is where the fun is, the discovery along the way with a board driven show. So we would understand what the show was. And if there were a couple of big beats, we'd go with them. And occasionally we would get a premise that would be like, Patrick and SpongeBob go up onto the Ferris wheel or into the tunnel of love. You decide. And we were like, okay, we will, whatever. They weren't interested in nailing down every beat because they knew that we were going to follow them and unravel everything. So we would have the storyboard teams would have 1 week to power out some kind of version of this story. And we would just be throwing post-it notes up onto the wall as fast as we possibly can. Not a lot of talk about what we were doing. Every once in a while I'd, yell over my shoulder, "Hey, Chuck, what do you think about this?" And he'd be like, "I don't know, give it a shot." And that would be it. It would go up on the wall. And then sometime around, Wednesday or so, we'd look at what was up there and say, okay, what holes need to be plugged here? We had broken it up a little bit. I'll take the first half, you take the second half. But how do we smooth from this into that? And how can you set up in your section this thing here that I do in my section so it's paid off? And we'd Frankenstein together something. And then Derek and Steve would come in and they'd look at it and they'd be like, no, 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 sort of, but how about no, no, no? And they'd give us our marching orders for the second week, and we'd go home and cry and then come in on Monday and start boarding again to Derek and Steve's specifications. Now stuff is getting serious, and we're still working on very, rough drawings on post-it notes so you can move them around and add in a pose and take out a pose. A lot of crossing out, pinning up papers. I mean, it's very, 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 very fluid. And we would work until Thursday afternoon, and then Derek and Steve would come back and we would pitch them the new version of the show. And then they would order dinner for us, and we would sit there, the four of us in that room, up to our knees in post-it notes, and rewrite and redraw everything and smooth out everything and add gags and let's cut this scene. Let's make sure that, Pearl says this thing in scene one and she's going to cry here. We would work on absolutely everything until we had a show that we knew we could pitch the following morning. So we're talking about a 5-day week and then a 4-day week. And then the following day, we're going to pitch this show to the crew. And so we get up, you go to work in the morning, you throw up or whatever it is that you need to do before you're going to perform. And everyone stands in the room and they've got their arms folded like, all right, entertain me. And we would have Eric Coleman, who was our studio executive, and sometimes Tom Kenny would show up because he's very interested in what he was going to have to do, but not always. And we would pitch the show, and you get up and you dance around and you do voices and you sweat like crazy and you try to keep the energy of the room up. And people either laugh or they don't. And it either works or it didn't work because everyone walks out silently at the end of the pitch and this chill descends over the room and you've got problems. Most of the time we didn't. We'd know, what, it went too long without a laugh here, come up with something new. This scene doesn't work. Here's what we should do. And they'd give us, a couple of drawings. And then the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I forget what it was, we would be cleaning it up and making the changes that needed to be made. So you would do the perfect drawings, the ones that are going to go overseas. Well, they're going to go into the animatic first, and then they're going to go overseas and be used as the roadmap for making this show. But that was basically the process. It was very, very seat of your pants, under the gun. It was an adrenaline fueled process making this show happen, and very much about discovery. You just get thrown into the deep end of the pool every single time you have a new premise, and you have to teach yourself how to swim.
Oh my God, I love you explaining all that. I have like a visceral thing of, oh my goodness, I could just imagine like all like the hard work and dedication and passion though, and just like, oh man, that's amazing.
There was one pitch. I mean, I used to I loved pitching, but every time, and how gross can I get here? Without fail, before every pitch, I would completely evacuate my bowels. Like I never felt nervous, but I would be like, oh, time to go do this thing, and then I'd be fine. And I would jump up, and when I'm pitching, I'm gone. And I remember pitching the fry cook games, and I got to that part of my section
Mm.
where we're intercutting between SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs and Patrick and Plankton. And they're trying to fire up the two friends to go fight each other in all of these games. And it gets faster and faster and faster. And at the end, we're cutting from one character to another with like two words, one word, whatever it was. And I'm up there doing this thing and doing all the voices. And when we were done and it was over and everyone was leaving, like 5 people came up to me and they were like, Jay, you were on fire in there. Like when you were switching voices and doing all that stuff. And I was like, I have no memory of any of that. Like you just, I mean, I think in a way that's how you can tell it was good, is that I was just possessed at that moment. And it's a very happy memory because you don't often get on a project that can kind of evoke that level of passion from you, where it's not even you anymore. It's like, I mean, that's the great thing about a show that's as well realized as SpongeBob is, that the characters tell you who they are. And in that moment, I was, I guess, possessed. I'm not even there.
That's amazing. Oh my God. I know you were responsible for the Nosferatu joke, which that's amazing in and of
Oh, I
itself.
won't let anyone go without finding out that I'm responsible
That's
for
so
that
fantastic.
gag. It's all I've got.
That's so, I have to ask though, with that specifically, like, did you have that idea or was it specifically for that episode? Like what came first with that, like chicken and the egg, that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, you can hear about this everywhere. So I can give you the very fast digest version. And that's that we were doing the I'm doing so and so at night. I'm doing this other thing at night section. And normally you do 3 beats, and the third beat is the weird one. And for whatever reason, I did 4 beats, and then the weird one was going to be it was going to be Floorboard Harry. So I'm delivering the mail to Floorboard Harry. And you can find these drawings online. SpongeBob lifts up a section of the floor, a little arm comes out of the darkness, and he hands him the mail. It's just a weird non sequitur, doesn't mean anything. And then when we got to the end of the show, Floorboard Harry is the one who's flicking the lights. So it's a callback to this earlier gag. But what happened was I had done 4 of those gags at night. And we didn't need 4, we only needed 3. So Floorboard Harry went. And then it was just too weird to have this. What is Floorboard Harry? What does that mean at the end of the show? But we still wanted it to be a non sequitur. So over the years, I've pieced it together and I understand what happened. I reached in my head, what is a scary non sequitur?
Mm-hmm.
And growing up like I did in the 70s and into the 80s, I used to read a magazine called Famous Monsters, which was all about the history and present of horror movies. And they would talk about all of these great movies that had come out in the past. And a lot of them are silent movies. And, back then there wasn't really, I mean, we could maybe get lucky and find it on beta, but there were no places to see silent horror films because they really didn't run them on television. Where are you going to run a silent movie? Maybe on UHF, like channel 67 at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, but they're not going to run it on any of the main channels. So I saw that image, that exact image of him standing in the doorway over and over again, because it was the file photo that they would pull when they talked about this classic movie that you can't see.
Mm.
So that visual is the horror non sequitur in my head. And I think when I needed to replace what's it called, Floorboard Harry, that was just like the ready image that fit the mold. And it just jumped out. I mean, it's not like I was sitting there thinking, what can I use?
Mm-hmm.
It just happened to be the thing. It was just like, oh, that thing, there it is. And that's where it came from. And it's probably, it's definitely the weirdest gag I ever was able to get away with. And it's probably my legacy. I don't, it doesn't matter what I do for the rest of my life. That's the most noteworthy thing I'll ever do.
That's good. Oh my God, so funny though. Anything with like live action stuff in cartoons always, because I know they did that a lot in SpongeBob too. Like they have live action gags, and
Yeah.
like, it's just so funny. It just like stands out, obviously. But
They did
what's
it a lot by comparison to what other people were doing.
mm-hmm.
But
Right? Okay, yes, true,
too much, it loses its impact. But
true,
nothing
absolutely.
can beat old people are great. And then cutting to Don Newsom, who was the parking garage attendant at Nickelodeon.
Oh, cool.
We
Oh,
loved. I mean, he was, he was a studio fixture
mm.
and just the cheeriest possible guy imaginable. So, when they thought of doing that gag and cutting to an old person, why would you use a stock photo when we've got our own guy? He was like the mascot for the studio. We loved him.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's sweet though. So with SpongeBob, would you say there was like a particular character that you personally loved to write gags for, or was it just, I guess, it depended on the
Oh,
episode?
always Squidward.
Nice.
Um,
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I'm a cynical guy by nature. I
Hmm.
complain a lot, and what Squidward would be thinking at any moment is what I'm already thinking. So he's the easiest one to write. I loved drawing him because he is the only character. He's got these, sort of attenuated limbs, and he's flexible, and he's really good for posing, nice gestural poses when every other character on this show is one variety of block or another. Like Mr. Krabs, you have his eyes to play with, and we do out of necessity, but he's this big inflexible triangle, and you can play with that, and we always do, but it's not natural to get a gestural pose out of him except for the sweep of his body going up to the eyes. And Sandy is a giant salt shaker. She's literally got a rigid circle around her head. Patrick has these stumpy legs. SpongeBob is all about being stiff. And, Squidward is just like, oh, thank God. I have someone that I can draw with, with big arms doing things. I can break up the form. He was so much fun to work with. I love Squidward to death.
That's fantastic. I know Squidward. I think people have always said this. It's one of those characters where the older you get, the more you sympathize with Squidward. I'm like, yep, like I
Yeah, and he's
wholeheartedly agree.
necessary for the show. I
Yeah.
think everyone realized right away, certainly Steve, that SpongeBob's cheeriness and upbeat stuff and his goofy intensity wears on you. At some point, he becomes really annoying, and Squidward becomes your window on the show for those moments when SpongeBob is starting to get annoying. Squidward can voice that frustration for you. The trick is that Squidward always takes it too far and then deserves the punishment that he gets. He's a warning to you, like, you're right to feel this way, but don't be an asshole about it.
Yes. That's too funny. That's true though. And I don't know if you're allowed to talk about this, but you're working on the current, like the upcoming, what's it called? Saving Bikini Bottom, Sandy Cheeks movie. I'm sure that'll
Well,
be great too.
there's not a ton that I'm able to say about it. I certainly
Okay.
won't talk about the story. For many months, I didn't say anything at all because they just refused to announce that this movie
Huh.
existed. But yeah, I worked on that as a storyboarder. It was a script driven movie. There were very few, if any, changes made to the script because of what we were doing as storyboarders. Our job was just to sort of visualize this script as well as we could, and we had a load of fun with it. I had sort of vowed that I was never going to go back to SpongeBob.
Hmm.
After I left the original show, I did not work on the movie,
Hmm.
and there was never an opportunity to go back and work on the show. But I was they very graciously offered me an opportunity to work on Camp Coral before it got started, but I felt like it wasn't for me, and I also felt like I got out of here with my reputation intact, and I did it before SpongeBob was so ubiquitous. And I kind of want to leave on a high. I was lucky enough to be there for just the first 3 years. We left, and the show left and created that desire for more. And that's kind of a good taste to leave in people's mouth,
Mhm.
always wanting more. And I didn't want to go back because I recognized that the more episodes of this you make, the harder it is to slot a new story in between two existing ones, because you're always saying, oh, this is kind of like that other thing we did, or this other thing we did. And it's hard to make something really fresh and good. And you can never have the impact we had first time out, when everything about that show was insane and new. Like there was nothing like it. And you can't beat that. All you can do is kind of soften the landing as you make more. And I didn't really want to make more, except for SpongeBob comics, which I did off and on for many years, because that was just a playground. We That was, I don't know if people are familiar with this, but there was a comic for several years, SpongeBob Comics, that was entirely owned by Steve Hillenburg. It had nothing whatsoever to do with Nickelodeon. They had no editorial control, no input. I don't think he ever would have done anything they were upset with, but it was Steve's opportunity to continue SpongeBob in an artistic vein. Um, Everyone who worked on that comic book was allowed and encouraged to work on SpongeBob in their own style. So you get comic artists like James Kachalka and Ramona Fraden, people, who have styles that are nothing like SpongeBob, coming in from the outside and making material that looks like them doing SpongeBob. And it's amazing. And I got to do my stories. Some of them I wrote and drew, some of them I drew, some of them I would write and do the layouts, and then someone would finish it. Um, Super fun. I got to scratch my SpongeBob itch. There wasn't any money in it for anybody,
Mm.
but it was, creatively very exciting. And I just wasn't really interested in going back, but I was offered this job on Camp Coral, and I was offered another job on the Patrick Show. And then I realized I am just becoming the guy who says no, and I can't afford to be that guy. So when they came to me and said, "Do you want to do the Sandy movie?" I was like, "Yes." And I went to work on the Sandy movie, and I had a blast. And 8 months later, it was over, and I would do another one in a heartbeat. There's a bit of a trap, and I'm sure that Steve probably felt it at some point, where you do your 3 years, and he walked away. He was done. I'm going to do my show. I'm going to do my movie. I think he had always intended to drop out after 3 years, like, this has run its course. And then you're happy to let other people do your thing. But at some point, it may have dawned on Steve, and I don't know what Steve was thinking. But in his position, I know I would have said to myself, I did 3 years, but they've done 7 years since I did my 3 years. And they're not really my show anymore. And they're good, but they're not what it was. And then your episodes are kind of being drowned by other people's vision of your show. And I can see hitting a point where you're like, let me come in and steer it a little bit and see if, more of SpongeBob feels like me. And maybe he was thinking that, maybe he wasn't. In his position, I would feel that way. But he's still in the position where, even if it's Steve, can it ever be what it was? And the answer is it can, but it can't be fresh in the same way. And, you know, it's a bit of a trap. So I don't particularly want to go back and do SpongeBob, but I kind of reset my head with the movies. I was like, it'll be fun to draw these characters doing cool stuff. I can do a little more with it in a filmic sense, because we're dealing with a movie in general and then live action on top of it. It is computer animated in to some degree real environments, on live action plates. And it was a fun challenge, but the challenge about it was not, I mean, the fun of it was, I don't want to say it wrong. I got to work on a combination live action animation thing, which I had never done. I got to do SpongeBob characters in a live action or in a theatrical mode, which I had never done because I didn't work on the feature. So I got to exercise some new muscles in a place where I wasn't also saying, "Oh, who are these characters? How do I draw them?" So it was good fun for me, and I would do it again. I would
Nice.
love to do a Squidward movie, and there's one coming. I would be perfectly happy to write and direct that one if anyone were interested.
Oh man. Oh hell yeah. I want to see that happen too. That's the thing, honestly, with something that's such a long running franchise at this point with SpongeBob, that now it's had so many iterations. Obviously, there's the CG with like the movies, and I know they've
Mhm.
done stop motion. I know they have the spin-off series now. But then there's certain shows. I mean, like look at The Simpsons, still going since 1989. Like, it's
Yeah,
just, and then again, it's like, how do you still keep it fresh? And people are
I
still
think
watching it
The
though.
Simpsons is able to do that in part because they can be topical. Not just dealing with trends. I mean, SpongeBob now is made by and for people who live now. And in some sense, they're making the show that should be made. They're making something that is true to this moment. But The Simpsons, because it is satire of politics and culture and stuff like that, can be much more specific. And maybe the appropriate way to watch any of these shows, certainly The Simpsons, which has been running for 30 years or whatever, is you have a 10-year range where The Simpsons works for you. And everyone's range is 10 years. They're not all the same 10 years. The shows that were made at the time for them are in their range. Those are their shows. And I'm sure there are people out there who say, you know what? The best years were 97 through 1005 or 2005. And they're right for them.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it too, because a lot of people say the golden age is like the early seasons, I guess. I just find that interesting that now it has literally over 700 episodes still going, and who knows when it's gonna
Yeah.
stop. But
I mean,
it's
could
fascinating.
SpongeBob benefit from some time off so that we can come back to it fresh? Probably. That's not going to happen. That's not the way networks make their decisions. They're going to ride it until the horse dies, and then it will get its time off. But they're not going to just say, "Let's retire this." But now would be a great time for Hey Arnold to come back. And they sort of flirted with it by making the Jungle Movie, and the Jungle Movie I think was sort of rethought because we were truly in a different era when they made the movie from when they first wrote the movie, because that script was done. They were going to make that movie and then it didn't happen. But they had to reconsider, what is Hey Arnold now? And I think it would be great to have a new Hey Arnold series now. How do you deal with, because life for kids is completely different now. Some of those stories that they told back then still make a lot of sense, but maybe some of them don't. And then there are all new stories that can happen with Hey Arnold that we would never have imagined back then.
Yeah, because I know fans definitely want to see a season 6, and then also the Patakis. There's all like these. I know Craig
Yeah.
had said he has an idea for like a possible movie for about Gerald, focusing on Gerald. So I would love to see more Hey Arnold. So let's manifest that in the Squid movie. That all sounds great too. Too funny. I could like sit here and like go through your whole like like all the projects you've worked on and everything, Jay. But I did want to touch on like a couple of other things. So I saw you had worked on Lion King 1.5, which I'd love to
I
hear
did
about.
not. I did not. You will
Oh,
see. This is going to cut a lot of time out of your interview.
okay,
You
no,
will
no
see
worries.
a lot of things in my IMDb listing that I have nothing to do with.
Oh,
And there,
yeah.
I sort of feel like it's not my job to go in there and remove credits, especially when I'm looking for work. Like if Lion King 1.5 can get me a new job, fine. But the fact is, I never worked on that, and I never worked on Fairly Odd Parents, and
Oh,
I never worked on Ozzy and Drix or whatever else is showing up in my thing. It's not all true. If you see it listed on my website, it's true. I did work on Angry Beavers. I did one episode of that. It's not all the case. So name a show, I'll tell you if I
that's
worked on it. Like
that's so weird
what
on
were
IM.
the things you wanted to talk
That's so
about?
weird on IMDb. Well, because I saw also Rugrats on there. So was that?
I took a test for Rugrats. I don't
Oh,
recall ever working on it. I mean, back in those days when Nickelodeon was still building up their crew and there weren't a lot of animation professionals out there in the world, they always tried really, really hard to keep you around between shows. So, Hey Arnold may have finished up a 13 episode order and we'd go on hiatus, but they wouldn't send you packing. They'd find something else for you to do. And I don't think I've forgotten working on Rugrats, but maybe I've forgotten working on Rugrats. If I did something, it would have been like, 2 weeks of cleanup work for Rugrats just until they were ready to bring me back to Hey Arnold.
oh, gotcha. Okay. Also, that's so IMDb. That's so weird that like all these some of these
It's
credits.
unfortunate. The only thing you can really trust is episode credits. To the best of my knowledge, I've never actually, and I don't mean on IMDb, I mean on the product. I don't think I've ever received a credit on a show where I didn't work. And there have been a couple of things I've worked on that I did probably don't have a credit on, but not too many of those either. But if you watch the show and see my name, I was there.
Cool. Okay. Well, so I did want to ask you though about your movie They're Watching and your experience directing that. I'd love to hear about that project a little bit.
Sure. That was after I finished up on Phineas and Ferb. I did 4 years on that show. I left the studio and got back together with Micah Wright, who had been a writer on Angry Beavers way back in the old Arnold days, the old Nickelodeon days, and had his own pilot, Constant Pain. And you should do an episode on that.
Hmm.
That was killed around the time we tried to bring the Writers Guild into Nickelodeon. And the two of us had gone out after I finished up on SpongeBob and worked in video games together for about 8 years. And in 2008, when the economy sort of dried up, I had to go back to animation. There wasn't enough video game work for the two of us. So I did my 4 years on Phineas and Ferb. And then when that was over, I got back with Micah and said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "Well, I've met a guy who has a lot of money who wants to get into movie production. I want to pitch him an idea." So we had this idea. He pitched it to the guy. This is at a time when these first person camera movies, found footage movies, ours is not actually found footage, but it is a first person camera movie. They were very, very hot. And we had an idea for our movie that was going to solve some of the problems of the first person camera movies. First and foremost, being that they're all shot by terrified, non professional camera people. The characters are, like kids in the woods who are scared of a witch. So the camera's shaking all over the place, and no one wants to look at that for an hour and a half. So we decided we would tell our story about professional camera people, which has a history in this. You go back to some of the very earliest of these movies, Man Bites Dog, which is a French movie like this. It's about a camera crew. So we said, let's do that. Now you've got professionals holding your camera, and it cannot be shaking all the time. And we came up with a story that had to do with a TV production company. They're out there filming, House Hunters International.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're taking an American to a little village in Europe somewhere. They're going to buy a house. They're going to restore the house. And after the commercial, we come back 6 months later to see how they're doing. So our movie is about the crew going back 6 months later to see how this American is doing. And she's great. She looks great. The house is beautiful. Everything is amazing. It's the best restoration they've ever seen. But the people in the village don't like her. And it's creepy and weird. And our movie was not just going to be about, as they say in horror movies, the kills with
Mm.
giant air quotes. How are we going to murder all of these people? It was going to be about something. So our movie is about ugly Americanism because this crew is over there tromping around in this European town like they own the place because we're from TV and we're Americans. You guys are backward Europeans in a little village and we think you're all hilarious. And it's going to be about selfie culture. What's wrong with us now that we feel the need to film everything we do like we are our own entertainment for consumption later? And it's going to be about voyeurism because that's the flip side of selfie culture, is that someone else is watching you do all this stuff. So we wrote this really cool script and we got our cast and we got our money together and all of the trials and tribulations you can imagine doing an independent production. And there were many. And then we got on a plane and we went to Romania. And these two animation directors who had never really directed a movie before, but had directed a lot of work, got ready to make this movie. And we hired a bunch of very, very, very professional production people, uh, costume designers, set decorators, line producers, camera people, everyone overseas to make this thing happen. And they come from a very different filmmaking culture there. Every movie is pieced together out of grant money and film foundation and museum arts foundation donations. And everyone's putting in a little bit of cash and nobody cares what you make. So
Mm.
every filmmaker is an auteur and they go out there and they're like, all right, here we are at this monument and we have our actors. Let's film something today. What should it be? And Micah and I were coming from animation, where every detail has to be understood and known and planned before you ever expose a frame of film. And we were like a tornado to these guys. They couldn't believe what was happening. Like, here's what we need to do. Here's what it looks like. I've storyboarded every scene in this movie that has anything in it that requires any thinking whatsoever. And we're going to film this from here and we're going to film that from here and we're going to go this fast and it's going to be done and we're going to be done with this, at this time. We're going to move on to that. And their line producer, I'm sorry, our assistant director was like, there's no way you can film this in 23 days. It's going to take much longer than that, and we have to set up and we have to think and we have to experiment and we have to rehearse. And we said, that's not the way any of this is going to go. And we did the first 3 days, I think, of this production where we're doing it our way. And our actors came really well prepared. We didn't have a lot of time to rehearse, but it was probably for the best because it kept them feeling very natural. And we wanted this to feel super loose and natural, not like Hollywood acting, because we want it to be believable that these are real people who are not the performers. So we go in and we shoot, and the first day we wrapped at like 3 in the afternoon. And Micah and I were raising our eyebrows at each other. This is not cool because we have hours more that we could be doing, but we're not prepared for it because our assistant director talked us out of it. We did that for 3 days. And then we had a come to Jesus meeting with him. And we were like, we need to get this schedule the way we wanted to do it. So we redid the entire schedule. And then we start pow, 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 moving through it really fast. And all of these people who were very, very doubtful of that kind of schedule and that kind of pacing suddenly got really into it. So we had this crew that was used to going out there and playing. They got very excited about accomplishing. And I'm not going to tell you or anyone that they didn't know what they were doing or that we were better at anything than them. It was just a different style of filmmaking. We were not out there to make something as we went along to allow it to grow. We were there to document this thing that we had in mind, this very specific thing. And they really hadn't worked like that, but they got into it. They loved what we were doing, and suddenly there was a ton of laughter on the set. And it was a great experience until we got home. We kind of, every time you make a movie, you are at risk of, terrible failure. It's a terrifying process, and the movie doesn't happen until you're in the editing room. And this is true for animation, where you make your animatic and you can have your storyboard and it sounds great. And you may have your voices recorded and they're great. But when you put it all together, that's when you see, you know what? This doesn't work. It seemed like it was great, but it doesn't work. And you fix it. It's in the editing room where you rewrite and you recut and you do what needs to be done to make it great. So before we went over to Romania, and by the way, you let me know if I'm going on too long. So before we went over to Romania, I spoke to a friend of a friend who was a very accomplished filmmaker. And I said, what do I need to know? And he said, I've made 15 movies and I know a lot of people, friends, who have gone to make their movie. And eventually they get to that point where things get screwed up and it seems like it's not going to happen. And they decide, all right, let's call it off. Let's go home, reorganize, and then come back with our act together and finish it off. Don't do that, he said. I've never seen, he said, I know a lot of people who've done that. I've never met one of them who went back and finished the movie. Get material in the can. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's what you wanted. Get the raw material. You can make something out of it when you get home. But if you don't have the material, you can't. And then you're done. So we got home and, we saw tons of things that just weren't working when we edited them together. And that's where I sort of discovered, I knew it intellectually, but when you're under the gun like this, you really get it in your bones that film is clay. We all want to believe that, film is just the document of the performances. We're going to go out, we're going to plan, we're going to rehearse, and then I'm going to point the cameras at my actors, and I'm going to get the scenes that make my movie. But that's not how any of that works. So you get your stuff together and things work or they don't work. But you know what would fix it? If this character would say this. Yeah, but they're saying this other thing that's no good. Well, do we have another shot of that person from the back where you can't see their mouth? So you use that shot and then you call that actor back and you loop them saying the thing you want them to say. And then that other scene later on works. And it's clay. You make it into whatever you make. We're sliding audio around. We're using audio from one scene over another scene entirely that wasn't even the intent, but you make it into something. And we made it into pretty much what we wanted. It's a slow burn movie. And if you are there to see the kills, you will get them. But first, you're going to watch the character-driven workplace comedy that we have set up for you, because it's not really a horror movie. It's sort of a workplace comedy that goes terribly, terribly wrong. And at the end, we go completely intentionally off the rails. And some people go with us and some people don't. But the people who go with us, who, by the way, are exactly who we knew would go with us, primarily young married women, but really like 20-year-old and up women in particular, it's made for them. We felt like they are underrepresented, particularly in the horror space. And we're very interested in that, not just because, from a marketing standpoint, there's an audience, but also because it gives us the chance to tell stories that we don't normally tell. I would love to be a part of a story about a woman. Maybe I'm not always the right person to do that, but also the industry has been set up for decades to not do it at all. certainly in the action space, often in the comedy space, definitely in the horror space. So we wanted to do something different. And I think, we were very happy with what we created. Has it set the world on fire? No. Part of the reason for that is that our distribution company released our movie into 3 theaters and then told us the next day we're going out of business. So
All right.
we they kind of half-assed our launch. And when we told them, we're like, now listen to us, and we're serious. We want you to advertise this thing on home and garden television. And they were like, what? It's a horror movie. No, 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 no. And the conversation ended right then and there because they were thinking, let's just get our money, release this movie, and go out of business. But we didn't know that was coming.
Mhm.
So over the years, and I'll bring you back to where I was earlier, we have discovered that the people who love this movie are exactly those people that we wanted to reach out to, but we didn't at the time when we had a budget to promote it. It's available now. You can see it on Tubi and a couple of other places. I think you can buy it if you're so inclined on Apple's iTunes.
Nice. That's a really cool story that I like hearing about. That's good advice too, about like just get it filmed and there you go. That's really good. I did also want to ask you about your children's book too, and this title is fantastic. Poopy McPooFace. You can't go The Perilous Journey. You can't go wrong with poop jokes. That's
No,
so
you
funny.
you well, you can only go wrong with poop jokes.
Okay.
Yes, it's Poopy McPooFace in The Perilous Journey. This is
Mhm.
written by David Michael Slater, who I got hooked up with about 6 years ago. He is a novelist and writer of chapter books for tweens and nonfiction books about teaching. He's just one of these people who constantly writes. And I got hooked up with him because he had a book called Fun and Games, which is a coming of age story set in the 1980s about a young Jewish kid in Pittsburgh who's sort of the keep your head down member of a family of extremely exceptional people in one way or another. And a lot of that resonated with me right away. And this is not, he wanted to get a movie made out of it, not a cartoon, but through weird circumstances, it ended up in my lap. And I loved what he had written. I loved his sensibility. I wrote a screenplay for it, which everywhere we send it, they're like, we love this screenplay, but we can't make it because it feels too niche. Regardless, his following book called Sparks, which is a strange Dickensian orphanage slash superhero Nazi genetics story and road trip. Don't ask me, but it's true. I loved that one too. I wrote a screenplay for that. We are shopping that around. And his third book that I tackled is called The Vanishing. It is a Holocaust story about a young girl who witnesses a horrific crime and turns invisible. And then, because she is invisible, is able to travel from the Jewish neighborhood into the ghetto, to the concentration camps, to the woods where she fights with the partisans and beyond. It's a sort of magic realist survey story of Jewish life during the Holocaust. It's fascinating and extremely uplifting and tragic. It is, not a comfortable story, but it's written for young adults to talk about very uncomfortable things. And I adapted that last year. And I think we will have some very good news about that shortly, but it's not the kind of thing that is going to come out now when we're in the middle of a writer's strike. Anyway, having finished that book, he started on his next book, Poopy McPooFace in the Perilous Journey, which is just a little throwaway kids book about a poop that escapes from a toddler's diaper and has to get through the house safely while he's being chased by the kid, the dog, and the mom on his way to wherever poops go. And he said, I want you to illustrate it. And I'm like, really? Do I have to illustrate this poop book? I mean, not that I have a problem with poop. I'm a big fan of it. I do it every chance I get. and I like poop jokes, but illustrating a book beginning to end was a terrifying prospect for me. That was my real objection to it, that I would be taking this tremendous bite that I would not be able to swallow. And he and his publisher came to me, I think, 3 times before I finally said yes, just to make it stop. And I spent 8 months doing wildly over rendered cartoons of this poop traveling through the house and going on his adventure. And it's super fun. I love it. It just came out very recently. I'm hoping we will go into a second printing on it soon so we can fix a couple printing issues that we have with it. But if someone were to ask me to make a TV series out of it, I would be thrilled to do so, and I would be happy to do more. Now that I know what I'm doing, I would be happy to do more children's books like this. There's not a ton of money in it, but coming off of a time where I've been primarily doing screenwriting for the past 6 or 7 years, it was great to kind of get back into my art chops. And, at this point, I'm 53 years old. I'm starting to think about legacy a little bit. And if Nosferatu and poop have to be my legacy, so be it.
Fantastic. So funny. Jay, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. So as we're wrapping up, I always like ending my interviews by asking if you have any advice. So advice for artists trying to break in, or just life advice, any sort of advice you care to share.
Well, I touched on it earlier. I think the biggest advice I can give you, and I think everyone is interested in how you break in. And breaking in, like anything else in this town, luck is a huge component. I mean, the people who have huge successes a lot of them are inclined to tell you that they know how that success happened. And, it makes them feel like they are worthy of that success. And I understand all of that. And certainly it's helpful to have the goods when your lucky break comes. When that door opens up and the red carpet rolls out, you may walk through, but if you don't deliver, they may not let you stay. So most of the people who make it big have something valuable. Nothing on earth is going to guarantee that people who have something valuable will make it day to day, or to the big leagues, or afterward. I've gotten in, I broke in, I did big noticeable things. I still have trouble getting work. But what you can do is first recognize that luck has a lot to do with it. Who you know has a lot to do with it. So if you can't be, I mentioned earlier that you hire your friends, then you hire friends of friends. If you can't be a friend, and you can't be a friend of a friend, like I said, be sitting in the lobby, be omnipresent in the lives of people who can give you your break, because they have no loyalty to you. So if you aren't there at the moment when they need you, then they're not going to come looking for you. So I used to be very worried that I was going to annoy people by asking them if they had work too often, bringing in my portfolio too many times, calling too often. Now my philosophy is call as often as you want, write as often as you want, but make sure that it's worth their while to read your thing. So write them an entertaining letter. Send them something with a funny picture in it, or a funny drawing, or whatever it is, so that it's not just you sucking up part of their day. They'll be like, oh, there's that guy again. And then when the moment comes that they need to fill that slot, maybe you have become the friend of a friend at that point. Maybe when someone recommends you to someone, they hear, oh, I know that name. I have good feelings about that person. And that makes the difference for you. So, be good, be entertaining, be omnipresent. That's the advice. I mean, I don't want to say Never give up. That's another thing you hear a lot, because someone who's 60 years old sells their first book. Never give up. You can do it. Well, no, you got very lucky and you had a good book when you were 62 years old. And maybe that only happened because you were 62 years old, that part of the story was what made the difference for them, because you're marketable and you're interesting in a weird way. You will never know what happens behind the scenes. So all you can do is have good work, be in their face, and be fun to be around. Because especially when you're pitching, you're not just pitching your idea. I spent many years pitching good ideas. It's not just about the good idea. You're pitching the idea of working with yourself. Like, Seth MacFarlane didn't come in to Fox with a brilliant show. He came in with the next iteration of The Simpsons, but he came in as Seth MacFarlane, incredibly engaging voice man and performer and writer who had a cool story about being young and had his act together. He knew what to do, and he solved the immediate problem that every executive has, and that is, oh, I can sell this guy to my boss. Oh, our money is safe here. He makes me feel like our investment is safe with him. So, not everyone can do that. Certainly not this guy who vibes so well with Squidward. I don't know that I am necessarily that guy. That's a cultivated skill if I've got it. But that's what they're looking for, is to feel good about you.
Absolutely. Listen, well said. That's all fantastic advice. I've heard a lot of that too. And it's true though. But like, instead of never give up, just like keep being persistent and keep making art. So yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, I'm always writing screenplays. I'm always developing shows in the background. I've got a huge library of IP because I don't know when the right moment for any one of those is going to be. And when you walk in and you sell your thing to this, or you try to sell your thing to this person, and they're like, nah, not for us. What else have you got? You need to be ready with what else have you got? Well, I've got another thing that I think might work for you. Why don't I come back and pitch that in 2 weeks when you're not in the mood to say no?
There you go. There you go. Too good. Jay, feel free to share your social media and any like projects you want to promote.
Sure. Well, we have Poopy McPooFace, and I think, do you have a website where people can see links?
Yes, yeah. I can
Okay.
drop a link.
So you can look up Poopy McPooFace in the Perilous Journey just about anywhere. Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You could probably have your book company, your bookstore order it for you. I have a graphic novel that I wrote with my writing partner called Duster, and please do not get that from Amazon because I don't get anything for those copies. But if you go to jlender.com, you will find your way through that. It is a World War II home front feminist adventure story, which I think is super cool, graphic novel. And nothing else handy at the moment, but hopefully some things to hawk soon. If you follow me on Twitter at jlender1, that's the number 1, or jlender on Instagram, you'll know whatever it is that I'm up to.
Awesome. This was so great. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun.
And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to check out storytellingsaga.com, and as always, feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by emailing me at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next episode, I'll be discussing the latest Pixar movie, Elemental. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.